The scorching heat of a Madrid afternoon in the 1600s was not the only weight the royal family carried. Within the gilded walls of the where luxury and prestige intertwined with decay, the true burden was not in the glittering jewels or the luxurious garments, but in the crown, the Spanish crown, heavy not just with gold and precious stones, but with the legacy of generations that had fallen before it, building a vast empire that was simultaneously thriving and dying. Power, both a gift and a curse, meant that the royal family lived in a state of isolation, surrounded by a court that bowed to their authority but distanced itself from their humanity. Before we dive into this episode of Mystery and Decay, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you never miss a fascinating story like this. And if you enjoy the content, leave a like. It helps keep the empire of our production strong and steady. The monarchs, in their quest to maintain the supremacy of the crown, did not hesitate to make radical decisions, sacrificing not only the well-being of their children, but the future of their very dynasty. Marrying close relatives was almost sacred within the Habsburg family. It was deemed necessary to preserve the purity of the royal bloodline, but few could imagine that this desire to hold on to power so fiercely would lead to the destruction of their own heirs. The beauty of the crown was undeniable, but it also sealed the fate of every person who wore it. The kings and queens of this lineage carried with them the awareness of what they were sacrificing: the health, the intelligence, and even the happiness of their children. What could be more cruel than ensuring the throne at any cost, even if the price was the lives of their own bloodline? This was the reality of a dynasty that believed its power should be protected at all costs, without realizing that the real threat was not external, but internal. The crown, which should have been a symbol of grandeur, became a chain, binding generations to an inevitable fate. The great mistake of the Habsburgs was believing that power could be preserved forever, without considering that human nature, and even biological nature, could not be controlled. Those who ascended the throne were, above all, human. Their physical and psychological frailties could not be hidden forever beneath the weight of royalty. The burden of the crown was unbearable, and over time the dynasty began to quietly unravel, as if the very bones of the empire were corroding. The tradition that endured in the House of Habsburg was considered a political necessity, but there was nothing natural about it. Marrying close relatives was not seen as an act of love or a personal choice, but rather a sacrifice for the preservation of power. Each arranged marriage, every union between uncles and nieces, cousins and even siblings, had one singular goal: to preserve royal blood. However, what seemed like a strategy of pure conservation, without fully understanding the true consequences, later revealed itself to be a curse disguised as a dynastic practice. Margarita Teresa, for example, was the niece of her own father and, at the same time, the daughter of her mother, Mariana of Austria, with whom the king had married, thus keeping a narrow line of consanguinity within his lineage. This was supposedly a strategy to ensure the purity of royal blood. However, what appeared to be a genetic advantage in preserving power soon became the focus of a series of biological and health problems. The bodies of the royal offspring began to succumb to the effects of this repetitive practice, with the side effects becoming more evident with each generation. The consequences of this behavior did not take long to manifest. The royal lineage was being devastated, not by external enemies, but by the failure to understand what it means to preserve a pure bloodline. A genetic purity that, instead of ensuring strength, became the poison of a family that was self-destructing. Children were born with severe health problems, such as physical deformities and, in the worst cases, an inability to have children. The weight of this practice, which not only weakened the family's health, but also jeopardized the future of an entire empire, weighed heavily on the court's shoulders. It was ironic to think that while the Habsburgs believed they were securing the future of their empire, they were, in fact, paving the way for its collapse. The concept of blood purity, far from being a symbol of strength, became the weakest link in the chain that bound the dynasty. Each marriage, far from being a strong alliance, became a minefield of genetic flaws and physical limitations. An entire empire would collapse due to decisions made centuries before, with the consequences not yet understood. As the years passed, the ambition of the House of Habsburg grew more and more. Each marriage, each alliance, was a desperate attempt to ensure the succession of the throne and the stability of the empire. But what began as a strategy to preserve the royal bloodline soon became an unrelenting prison for the descendants of this dynasty. The obsession with maintaining power within the family blinded the monarchs to the signs of decline. The rules, which were meant to protect the empire, began to imprison future generations. The dynasty's fate was marked by the belief that only royal blood could sustain power. The idea that an alliance outside the family circle would weaken the line of succession became a mantra. But instead of strengthening, these rigidly imposed rules became the Achilles heel of royalty. Each generation felt the weight of the burden. What should have been a powerful lineage transformed into a series of genetic tragedies, where heirs were born fragile, sickly, and incapable of managing the empire they were once given. Carlos II, for example, the last great heir of the Habsburg dynasty, personified the collapse of this ambition. His weakened health and compromised mind were direct results of a family practice that had extended for centuries. The desire to preserve the bloodline through inbreeding had led to the destruction of everything he represented. He was a prisoner of a dynasty that no longer knew how to adapt to the changing world around it. As the lineage deteriorated, the Habsburgs themselves began to realize that the power game, which had once been so effective in the past, was becoming a ruin. What seemed like an unshakable throne was, in fact, doomed to fall. However, this realization did not reach all members of the family. Some still saw their rules and ambitions as the key to the empire's survival, unaware that, in reality, they were merely accelerating its collapse. The ambition to keep power in their hands ultimately imprisoned the family in its own decline. Inside where luxury and pomp blended with decay, nothing was as striking as the sight of the royal court. The royalty exuded an aura of unattainable grandeur, their garments embroidered with gold, their thrones adorned with velvet and jewels, and the air filled with the scent of fine perfumes. The court stood as a fortress of power, immune to the weight of past generations and their failures. However, behind every bright smile and refined gesture, there was a truth that no one wanted to admit. The empire was rotting from the inside out. The heirs, adorned with the beauty of royalty, were forced to represent the glory of a declining empire. But when looking closely, the truth became impossible to ignore. The genetic diseases afflicting the royal family members were not immediately visible, but they soon became undeniable. The shine of crowns and the luxurious garments couldn't hide the physical deformities and health issues that had become a constant in the younger generations. Even with all the resources of the court, the children of the dynasty were fragile, with bodies and minds failing as the generations passed. Princess Margarita Theresa, for example, was the very image of royal beauty, but her fragility was evident to those around her with a condition that no amount of powder or perfume could disguise. Her body, sickly and helpless, passed through the court like a specter, carrying with it an unmistakable scent reminiscent of rot. Even in her youth, the princess embodied the decay of her lineage, trying to hide the deterioration beneath a veil of external perfection. The throne, with all its beauty and splendor, became an illusion. While the royalty used all their strength to maintain appearances and display grandeur to the world, the empire was slowly disintegrating from within. The golden walls of the palace stood as silent witnesses to a power that, instead of being renewed, was being eroded by its own vices and wrong choices. Within the golden corridors of the palace, whispers were constant. The heirs to the crown, in their grandeur, were also victims of a cruel fate that stretched across generations. The throne, which should have represented strength, had now become a symbol of fragility. The genetic diseases, the result of centuries of consanguineous marriages, began to affect the younger generations, gradually eroding their physical and mental health. While the royalty did everything to preserve the appearance of grandeur, the bodies of the heirs were silently deteriorating. Carlos II, perhaps the most emblematic example of this tragedy, was a king who never had the strength to govern. His body, fragile and deformed by generations of close-kin marriages, failed in every aspect of his existence. His malformed jaw, his inability to speak properly, his motor and intellectual difficulties were the direct result of a practice that, although considered a political strategy to maintain power, created a monarch unable to fully take the throne. Mental health was also affected. Carlos II, already physically frail, had a mind that couldn't keep up with the challenges of his reign. Beyond him, other family members suffered from similar afflictions, making governance impossible for many and creating an impasse for Spain's future. The idea of preserving the purity of royal blood led to the collapse of a lineage that should have been a symbol of strength and stability. Inside the palace, the scene was desolate. The future of the dynasty was being eroded by its very genetic inheritance, which should have been the royal family's greatest asset. The obsession with keeping power within one family had created a generation of heirs who were incapable, trapped by their own biology. The glory of the throne was becoming, more and more, an empty illusion. Inside the luxurious chambers of the palace, mirrors were not only instruments of vanity but also brutally honest. They reflected the decay of the bloodline, a decay that no one wanted to accept. Previous generations had been marked by imposing appearances and immaculate bodies, but the heirs of the Habsburg dynasty could no longer hide the devastating effects of decades of inbreeding. As the physical and mental condition of the princes and princesses deteriorated, the mirrors were the final truth that could not be ignored. Carlos II, once again, was a vivid reflection of this reality. His eyes were dull, his face pale, and his posture, hunched with physical pain, showed the damage that his ancestors' choices had caused. But it wasn't just his physical aspects that defined him. The young king struggled with a mind that couldn't process the complexities of ruling an empire. His counselors and ministers, many of whom treated him with condescension, knew he did not possess the capacity to govern the realm. But he wasn't the only one. The sisters, cousins, and other members of the royal family also suffered from the same symptoms. Their suffering wasn't only in their bones or joints but in their minds, which disintegrated over the years. Those who were meant to rule were now trapped in their own limitations, incapable of fulfilling the responsibilities that power required. And as the empire teetered on the brink of collapse, the mirrors continued to reflect what the court refused to see. The physical and mental deterioration of the heirs to the throne was an undeniable sign that the Habsburg dynasty was disintegrating from within. The mirrors, in their coldness, did not lie. The beauty of royalty had transformed into an empty facade, reflecting a decay that no one could deny anymore. As the 17th century neared its end, a growing shadow of despair loomed over the Spanish court. The empire, once the largest in the world, was on the brink of collapse, and the Habsburg dynasty, which had long held the throne, seemed to be dying along with its heirs. The death of Carlos II in 1700 was not just the end of a life, but the end of an era, of a legacy of power that, though magnificent, was irrevocably stained by the tragic choices of past generations. When Carlos II finally succumbed to the illness that had tormented him throughout his life, it was not only a monarch who was lost, but the last hope for the survival of a dynasty that had self-destructed during his reign. The Habsburgs had done what they could to maintain control, but the weight of their own physical and political failures had been unbearable. Carlos II's reign was marked not by strength but by fragility. His death did not just bring mourning to the court, but the bitter realization that the grandeur of the empire had been lost forever. In the palace corridors, the silence was almost deafening. Ministers and advisors gathered in distress, debating the future of Spain, now without a direct heir and with a decaying empire. The War of Spanish Succession that followed Carlos II's death was not just a struggle for power, but a fight for the survival of a nation that was already disintegrating. The future of Spain now lay in the hands of a new monarch, Felipe of Anjou, who was not from the Habsburg lineage, but from the House of Bourbon. The transition from one dynasty to another was not just political, but also a symbol of the collapse of a system. The hope that had extinguished with Carlos II gave way to a new era, where the Habsburgs would become only a distant memory, a reminder of what is lost when power becomes more important than the preservation of the bloodline itself. When Carlos II's death sealed the end of the Habsburg House in Spain, what remained was more than just a power vacuum. It was a fragmented legacy, torn apart by the very history of the dynasty. The vast empire the Habsburgs had ruled for centuries, stretching from Europe to the Americas, now seemed like an empty skeleton, a memory of a grandeur that would never be regained. Carlos II's weakened and decaying empire was soon succeeded by a new house, the Bourbon dynasty, which would bring deep and definitive changes, removing the last remnants of the Habsburgs. The name Habsburg was no longer remembered as a symbol of power, but as a tragic example of what happens when ambition overrides human well-being and natural logic. The purity of royal blood, which had been the obsession of the monarchs of this house, was no longer seen as a virtue, but as the primary cause of an entire dynasty's decay. The sacrifice of generations to ensure the throne had proven fatal, not only for the direct heirs, but for the very survival of an empire. What remained, then, was a lineage that disappeared under the weight of its own arrogance, marked by physical and mental deformities that, in the end, reflected the wrong political choices made. In the following centuries, the Habsburgs would be remembered not for the grandeur of the empire they created, but for the tragic consequences of their legacy. Their portraits, hung in museum walls, would serve as symbols of a dynasty that, at the height of its power, failed to realize it was sowing its own destruction. The Spanish Empire, once glorious, fragmented. The distant lands, once subjugated under the Habsburg rule, became fields of dispute as the Bourbon House emerged to take the place of an empire that no longer existed. The end of the Habsburgs was not just the death of a dynasty, but the end of an entire era in history, where the Spanish Empire found itself torn apart, not by external wars, but by its own biological heritage. Today, Carlos II is remembered not for his ability to rule, but as a symbol of the tragedy that happens when power is placed above the survival of a bloodline. He represents the final consequence of a dynasty that tried to preserve blood purity at any cost, but, in doing so, condemned itself to ruin. The history of the Habsburgs is a grim reminder that often the greatest enemy of a dynasty does not come from the outside, but from the internal choices that ignore the laws of nature. If you've made it this far, you already know how surprising and tragic the past can be. Don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with your friends who love history. Only together can we keep the memory of the dynasties that shaped the world alive.